Devin Crane leaned on the server rack like it was his college dorm futon and cracked open a cold energy drink. He took a slow, deliberate sip, smirked at me, and said, "You should head home, Charles. I have got it from here." I did not move. He said it again, waving that aluminum can like he had built our entire network infrastructure himself. He told me I had been here all day and needed to go chill. He spoke as if I was just some random guy loitering in the server room, and not the man who had spent the last 9 years keeping this whole system breathing. "My name is Charles Vance. I am 54 years old, and I live in Raleigh, North Carolina. Up until last month, I was the one Bradley Thorne, the chief technology officer, called at 3 in the morning when the back-end database caught fire. Now I am just a senior systems specialist, which is just a fancy way of saying I am the cleanup crew for their digital disasters. Devin Crane is 29. He came from some tiny financial technology startup in Austin, Texas, and they promoted him to lead engineer after barely 8 months of employment. I watched Bradley Thorne walk him into the boardroom 2 days ago, holding a USB drive that had my server architecture diagram on it, labeled and color-coded by me. Bradley pointed at the screen like it was his personal vision. Devin nodded along as if he had helped design it. That was the moment everything clicked for me. They were not promoting Devin because he was some kind of technical genius. They were promoting him because he looked the part. He talks fast, wears the right designer sneakers, and throws around phrases like cloud agnostic and zero trust pipeline, as if he had invented the internet. I stayed quiet during that meeting. Devin swaggered off to the incident review with Bradley and the rest of the suits. Meanwhile, I kept typing at my keyboard because someone still had to fix the legacy server that nobody else in this building understood. System uptime was bleeding out, and they were too busy patting each other on the back to notice the warnings. The error log was a complete mess of corrupted pointers and outdated dependencies. I traced the fault line in 5 minutes flat, deployed a patch, and left a short line in the commit notes. I wrote that it was a hot fix, and that maybe they should not ignore the text file instructions next time. Nobody would catch it unless they were actually reading the repository history. Which, let us be completely honest, nobody was doing anymore. I walked past the glass conference room as Devin held up my diagram and said something about streamlined redundancy failover. Bradley Thorne nodded like a proud father. The man had not written a single line of code since the first term of the president, elected in 2008. But now he was tossing around jargon he had probably searched online that morning. I did not wait for them to finish. I just grabbed my bag and left the office. But before I stepped out, I grabbed the energy drink that Devin had left on my desk. It was still cold. It was a shame he had done nothing to earn it. The next morning, I was halfway through my coffee when Bradley popped his head into the bullpen like a middle school principal doing rounds. He asked if I had a few minutes for a quick check-in. He motioned toward the glass conference room, the one we all called the fishbowl. Nothing about that room was ever quick or casual. It was the room where people went in with a security badge and walked out with a cardboard box. I followed him in and sat across from him. He did that thing where he smiled before speaking, as if what he was about to say should feel like a compliment. He folded his hands like he was pitching a tech talk and told me I had done really solid work over the years. I did not respond. I just let him talk. Then he drew out his words and said he thought I had peaked, which he claimed was fine. He said not everyone needs to keep climbing. There it was. Bradley leaned back in his chair like he expected applause for phrasing it gently. He told me they were restructuring to make space for digital natives and new perspectives. He said I had a ton of experience, and the best way forward was for me to help transition some of that tribal knowledge over to the newer team. He actually used air quotes when he said tribal knowledge. I kept my eyes on him and did not say a word. Right on cue, Devin walked by the fishbowl slow enough to make sure I saw him. He winked at me through the glass. Bradley kept talking, saying there would be no change to my title for now, acting like it was some massive favor, but he wanted me to use the next few weeks to hand off what I could. He called me a great mentor. No mention of severance, no mention of offboarding. Just a vague suggestion that I go quietly and help the guy who had just taken my job. I nodded once, got up, and did not shake his hand. I walked straight to my desk and opened my terminal. Devin was already parked in my chair, spinning side to side, eating the trail mix I kept in the drawer, with his feet up on the desk. He asked me if I knew how domain name systems actually worked under the hood. I stared at him, and he just grinned. I walked away without a single word the next morning. I watched the process unfold. A soft chime echoed through the bullpen, followed by a ripple of heads turning toward their screens. I opened my inbox and found absolutely nothing. I checked the internal chat tools, but my access to engineering channels had been restricted. 10 minutes later, the project dashboard updated. My name disappeared from 5 separate projects. The infrastructure monitoring board, which I had built from scratch, now showed to be determined where my name used to be. I walked over to DevOps and asked about a security ticket I had opened. The engineer, a young guy named Liam who had always been decent to me, blinked at me like I was a stranger. He cleared his throat nervously, looked over his shoulder to see if Devin was watching, and said Devin was handling that now. So, Devin Crane, who still did not understand how a basic domain name system resolved network requests, was now in charge of our entire production security architecture. I went to my manager's office, but the door was locked. I walked to human resources, hoping to get some clarity, but the receptionist gave me a rehearsed smile and told me the director was out for the day. It felt like everyone in leadership was suddenly out of the office, busy with urgent meetings, or not entirely sure what the plan was. Back at my desk, Devin had made himself at home. My whiteboard was wiped, and my notes were in the trash. He asked if I was cool with him switching the terminal to dark mode, typing without waiting for an answer. I did not reply. He asked what command I used to pull legacy logs from the cache server. I did not move. I just grabbed my old runbook, dropped it on the desk beside him, took my personal backup USB drive from my drawer, and walked out without another word. I went home and poured 3 fingers of bourbon into a mug. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the empty glass before opening my personal laptop. I clicked into a folder I called ARC, which I had created months ago because I knew the storm was coming and I did not want to drown with them. The first file I saved was an email from 2 months ago. Bradley Thorne had forwarded my database patch notes to the executive team, adding a comment that he had personally pushed the fix and saved the company from another server crash. He had not touched a command line since 2014, but he was taking credit for my 48 hours of sleepless work. Next, I gathered Slack screenshots where Devin had admitted to me in private messages that he did not understand Docker containers or why we even needed reverse proxies. Then I pulled the database server logs. Dozens of entries, including midnight rebuilds, were tied to my username. Devin's name was nowhere to be found. Then I checked my original employment contract. Clause 14 stated that any termination must be documented in writing within 72 hours, or all severance terms would default to a full payout of $140,000. It was day 5, and I had received nothing. They had just ghosted me, hoping that making me feel fired would achieve the same result as doing it legally. It was an unforced error, the exact kind that only happens when corporate leadership is arrogant and lazy at the same time. By morning, I was back at my desk like nothing had changed. Devin asked how to tell if a degraded server was experiencing a service hang. I answered him because I was still getting paid and obligated to support the team, but I also opened a blank document on my own computer and titled it Project Zenith. Every time Devin asked a question, I logged the time, the date, and what he did not know. I updated the ARC folder every night. They thought I was defeated, but I was prepping. On day 6, the silence got louder. No paperwork arrived. Around 2 that afternoon, Human Resources called. The representative, Sarah, spoke in a sweet, brittle voice, claiming there was a clerical mix-up with my offboarding documents and they would sort it out shortly. I let her talk, then asked if I was officially terminated. She paused and said she would not use that word yet. I repeated the word back to her, and she said they would have something in writing soon. I knew exactly what they were doing. They were trying to get me to train Devin without giving me a severance package. I recorded the date and time of the call, then hung up. Immediately called Daniel Miller, an employment lawyer in Durham. His voice was gravelly and calm. His office was located in a converted tobacco warehouse in Durham, a brick building with high ceilings and heavy wooden beams. When he spoke, he sounded like he had seen 100 corporate cleanups. He told me to send everything. Contract, logs, emails, and screenshots. I sent over 30 attachments within the hour. 2 hours later, Daniel called back. He told me they had already violated Clause 14 by failing to provide written notice. But he said there was something much better. North Carolina had recently passed a new labor statute. Under this law, if a company fails to deliver the severance package within 7 calendar days of termination, any non-compete agreement becomes completely void. By his count, tomorrow was day 8. He told me to stay quiet, let them send the package, and forward it to him immediately. Once they missed the deadline, we would file a notice of non-compliance and void the non-compete. I would be free to build whatever I wanted. Day 7 came and went with complete silence from human resources. Bradley Thorne did not look at me once in the hallway. Devin Crane was still hovering near my desk, pretending we were some kind of team while asking questions he could have easily searched online. He asked me how database replication lag affects search indexing, and I calmly explained it to him while logging the interaction in my Project Zenith notes. I finished the last few support tickets they had assigned me and watched the clock slow down as the afternoon dragged on. I was not going to make any waves. I just wanted them to miss that 7-day window. By day 8, I stopped pretending to care about their timeline. I sat at my desk and browsed technology articles, waiting. At exactly 4:42 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from Human Resources, with the subject line Severance and transition materials for Charles Vance. I opened the email and saw 6 attachments, a collection of standard legal agreements in portable document format, accompanied by a note thanking me for my years of service. They honestly believed they had checked their corporate boxes and secured their liability. I did not reply to HR. Instead, I forwarded the entire email to Daniel Miller with just 2 words in the subject line, "Too late." Then I closed my laptop, walked out of the building, and smiled for the first time in weeks. They had no idea they had just handed me the key to my own freedom. I went home, set up my personal server in my spare room, and began coding the foundation of Project Zenith. For the first time in years, I felt real energy in my work. The architecture was clean, the code was efficient, and there was no legacy clutter to hold it back. We designed it using advanced asynchronous data pipelines that could handle thousands of concurrent queries without database lockups. I worked alongside Justin and Brandon, 2 software developers I used to manage at Vortex Systems, who had grown tired of Devin Crane's incompetent leadership and reached out to me in secret. They had heard rumors of my departure and wanted to know what I was planning next. They did not even ask about initial salaries. They just wanted to build something that actually worked under a leader who understood the technology. We held remote coding sessions late into the night, compiling and testing our systems. In my spare room, surrounded by monitors and cables, we built a system that was 50 times faster than Vortex's platform. We would connect via encrypted video calls, drinking coffee and writing code until the sun came up. It was exhausting, but it felt clean. We were building something real, based on solid engineering rather than empty buzzwords. 3 weeks later, I walked down my driveway to check the mailbox and found a thick white envelope. It was a formal letter from Vortex Systems marked urgent. I took it inside, poured a coffee, and sat at my dining room table to open it. It was a cease and desist letter from their legal department. They accused me of breaching my non-compete agreement and misappropriating proprietary trade secrets related to Project Zenith. They claimed that the software architecture I was building belonged to Vortex Systems. They threatened a lawsuit seeking $500,000 in damages if I did not immediately shut down my servers and hand over all source code. I actually laughed out loud at the absurdity. Every single line of code for Zenith had been written on my personal hardware at my own table, long after I had left their building. I called Daniel Miller immediately. His gravelly voice was completely unbothered as I read him the letter. He clarified that since they delayed my severance until day 8, they had violated the 7-day rule, voiding the non-compete. He chuckled and told me it was a classic corporate scare tactic. He said they wanted to see if they could intimidate me into signing a settlement. Daniel told me to give him 36 hours to draft a response. When his letter went out, it was a masterpiece of legal precision. He cited the North Carolina General Statute Section 95-25.7, line by line, explaining that by delaying the delivery of the severance package past the 7-day statutory limit, Vortex Systems had legally invalidated all restrictive covenants, including the non-compete clause. He attached the email timestamps, my commit histories on my personal repository, and server log files proving I had never accessed company systems after my termination. He sent the response to their lawyers and copied the executive board. 2 days later, there was only silence from their side. Meanwhile, the cracks in their operations began to show. Devin Crane had tried to migrate the primary customer database to a new server cluster without understanding the dependencies. The system crashed, causing 48 hours of total database downtime for their enterprise clients. In a panic, Devin actually tried to call my personal phone 3 times, hoping I would bail him out. In the voicemail he left me, he sounded young, terrified, and completely out of his depth. He said the production cluster was completely locked, the replication logs were corrupted, and Bradley was screaming at him. He begged me for the decryption key to the legacy's archives. I did not answer. I just watched the calls go to voicemail. Bradley Thorne also sent me a message asking for emergency assistance, which I ignored. They lost 2 of their biggest accounts in a single weekend because of that failure. The board of directors wanted answers, and the investors were starting to demand blood. Instead of dropping the matter, Bradley Thorne did the opposite. Desperate to prove to the board and nervous investors that he was taking decisive action to protect the company's intellectual assets, he filed a formal lawsuit. The complaint accused me of breach of contract, misappropriation of trade secrets, and tortious interference, asking for millions of dollars in damages. When I read the court summons, I felt a brief flash of anxiety, but Daniel Miller was completely calm. He told me that desperate men make desperate mistakes, and that filing this lawsuit would force them to open their books to us. We immediately filed our answer, denying all claims, and submitted a request for full discovery. We demanded every email, Slack thread, meeting minute, and internal memo from Vortex Systems executives concerning my performance, restructuring, and offboarding over the last 6 months. Daniel explained that they would try to stall, but the law was on our side. While their lawyers fumbled with their responses, I kept my head down and focused on building Zenith. The database crash and subsequent client losses had severely damaged Vortex's reputation in the tech community, and word about my new platform began to spread. A representative from Summit Capital, a venture capital firm that focused on enterprise infrastructure, reached out to me. They had seen a demo of my prototype that Brandon and Justin had shared with an industry contact. They invited us to their offices, where the partners sat us down and asked search questions about our database performance. They compared our clean, modern architecture to Vortex's crumbling system and realized we had built the future of network scaling. After a single call, they were so impressed by the performance of Zenith that they offered us a seed funding round of $2 million. They did not care about the lawsuit. Their legal team had reviewed our documentation and agreed that Vortex did not have a leg to stand on. With $2 million in capital, we rented a small office in downtown Raleigh and hired Justin and Brandon full-time. Meanwhile, discovery documents began to arrive from Vortex Systems. It was a massive digital dump of over 10,000 pages, but Daniel and I spent 3 nights filtering through the files in his office, drinking bad coffee and reading through endless chains of boring corporate talk. It was a tedious process. We had to review thousands of emails containing boring corporate conversations about lunch orders, calendar invites, and marketing plans. But Daniel had a methodical way of searching. He used keyword filters for severance, notice, and my name. When the email thread from day 5 popped up on his screen, he did not shout or celebrate. He simply tapped the monitor, looked at me, and said that was the ball game. In that email, Bradley was discussing how to hold the papers until they were sure I had handed over the database access keys. Bradley Thorne had written directly to the Director of Human Resources, telling her to hold my severance packet back. He wrote that they should not send the papers yet because they needed to keep the severance as leverage to force me to transition my tribal knowledge and train Devon. He explicitly stated that if I received the package, I might just walk away. This was a direct written confession that they had intentionally delayed the severance, violating both my employment contract and state law. The day of the deposition arrived. We met in a glass conference room in Durham, where the cold air conditioning hummed and the court reporter sat silently by her machine, waiting to record every word. Bradley Thorne sat on the opposite side of the table, flanked by two corporate attorneys and an HR representative. He wore an expensive suit and tried to look confident, but his eyes were hollow and his hands were slightly shaking. The lead attorney for Vortex began the questioning, speaking in a polite but sharp tone. He asked me if I acknowledged that any software or architecture designs created during my employment at Vortex Systems were the exclusive property of the company. I answered that I did, but clarified that Project Zenith had been created entirely after my termination had taken effect. The attorney smirked and claimed they had internal notes indicating my termination was not officially finalized until after my off-boarding period. He argued that I was still technically an employee when I began coding Zenith. That was when Daniel Miller leaned forward, tapped the table, and said it was time to look at the facts. He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a stack of documents, and slid them across the table. He introduced Exhibit 17, the email from Bradley to Human Resources, instructing them to hold the severance package. Then he slid Exhibit 18, a Slack log where Bradley told my manager to make sure I did not get any paperwork until Devon had copied all my server architecture files. Bradley Thorne froze, his face draining of color as he stared at the printed pages. The lead attorney for Vortex stared at Exhibit 17, then at Bradley Thorne. He leaned over and whispered something to his co-counsel, who immediately started shuffling through their own binders, trying to find their copies of the document. The room fell completely silent, except for the high-pitched hum of the air conditioner and the steady click of the court reporter's machine. I looked at Bradley, whose jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles in his cheek twitch. He had spent his entire career playing corporate politics, taking credit for other people's work, and hiding behind vague jargon. But now, in this quiet room in Durham, he was face to face with his own written words. Daniel Miller did not smile or gloat. He simply pointed to the text of the North Carolina General Statutes, Section 95-25.7. He explained that by deliberately holding the severance payment to use as corporate leverage, Vortex Systems had violated the statutory requirement to deliver offboarding funds within 7 calendar days of termination. Under the state law, this violation automatically invalidated every single restrictive covenant in my contract, including the non-compete clause. The HR representative's face turned completely white. The lead attorney for Vortex stared at the documents, then stood up and announced they needed a short break. They scrambled out of the room, leaving Bradley Thorne sitting frozen in his chair for a moment before he slowly followed them. The recess lasted 20 minutes, during which we could hear muffled arguments from the hallway. When the door opened again, only their lead attorney returned. He cleared his throat and stated that Vortex Systems wished to propose a dismissal of the lawsuit with prejudice, meaning they could never file these claims against me again. Daniel nodded once and agreed that would suffice. We packed our documents, walked out of the Durham office, and did not say a word until we reached the parking lot. Daniel stopped by his car, looked at me, and said he told me they would trip over their own timeline. I laughed and told him he was right, and he started his engine, saying he usually was. The next morning, I received the official court notice confirming the dismissal with prejudice. It was a formal digital document signed by the judge, with the official state seal at the top. I stared at the words "dismissed with prejudice" for a long time. It meant the fight was finally over. There was no appeal, no second attempts, and no more threat of legal action from Vortex. It was the ultimate vindication of all the quiet nights I had spent documenting their incompetence. Vortex Systems could no longer touch me, or Project Zenith, and just like that, the company I had kept running for 9 years began to collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. The lawsuit had become public record, and within hours, someone leaked the internal emails and Slack logs to the media. The headlines were brutal, calling out Vortex's executives for deliberately delaying severance packages to avoid legal exposure. Every major tech blog and news site was running articles about the collapse of Vortex systems. The articles detailed how their stock price had dropped by 40% in a single week after two of their largest clients migrated their data to Zenith. The commentators on LinkedIn were discussing the case as a textbook example of how not to handle employee offboarding, citing Daniel's arguments about North Carolina labor laws as a landmark victory for tech workers. Some of the commentators were senior engineers who had faced similar bullying, and they were celebrating the outcome as a major victory. The article was shared thousands of times, and it became a trending topic in the software industry. It was satisfying to see the truth come out after they had tried to erase my name and contribution from their systems. Shareholders were furious, demanding to know why leadership had exposed the company to such massive liability. I checked their website, and within 48 hours, Bradley's name was removed from the executive leadership page. A brief notice stated that he had stepped away from his role to focus on his health and family. Former coworkers sent me screenshots of Bradley's social media profiles being edited in real time, showing his title changing to former Chief Technology Officer. He had turned off all comments to avoid the public backlash. Meanwhile, Zenith was humming with activity. We launched our platform on a Tuesday morning, and the release was completely flawless. We had no database downtime, no server drops, and onboarded 4 large enterprise clients within the first 12 hours. Our new office in downtown Raleigh was bright and clean, with large windows that let the sunlight in, a major change from the dark, windowless server rooms I had spent a decade in. Our office was filled with the sound of quiet typing and the hum of servers. Justin and Brandon were monitoring the dashboard, which was solid green. The platform handled the initial load without a single bottleneck, and we celebrated by ordering pizza and sitting on the balcony overlooking downtown Raleigh. It was the first time in 9 years that I did not feel the constant anxiety of a server room fire waiting to happen. My name was printed on the glass door in clean black letters, Charles Vance. I did not need a title under it because everyone in the building already knew who ran the systems. A month after the launch, I was invited to do a podcast interview for a popular tech founder show. The host was grinning as he asked me about the transition from Vortex to Zenith, eventually asking if I had any regrets about leaving my old company. I did not even pause. I looked at the microphone and said I did not leave. They released me, and that their little administrative delay had turned their corporate leash into my ladder. The host laughed out loud, but I was completely serious. That unforced error had given me the resources and freedom to build a competitor that was already outperforming them. After the recording wrapped, I shut my laptop, walked back to my desk, and opened a blank document to write my next build notes. There were no distractions, no managers trying to steal credit, and no incompetent engineers sipping energy drinks at my desk. There was only the code, the work, and the wide-open path ahead of us.